living things, from the simplest microscopic organisms, up through the largest, most complex animals and plants, are alike in one basic respect. All of them are made up of cells. Most cells are so small, they can only be seen by looking through a microscope. And by using powerful electron microscopes, scientists have discovered that these tiny cells are themselves made up of many highly organized components. All living cells can grow, repair, and maintain themselves, reproduce, undergo change, move, respond to their surroundings. And all living cells will eventually grow old and die. Because cells are the smallest biological structures capable of performing all of these life activities, they're called the basic units of life. In this program, we will learn what cells are, what their components are, and how these components work together to carry out the unique activities of life. Many of nature's simplest creatures are nothing more than single, independently living cells, and therefore are called unicellular organisms. By looking at a drop of pond water under a microscope, we can see some of these free living cells. The smallest and most primitive living cells are the bacteria we see here. Some bacterial cells are dangerous to humans and can cause infections such as strep throat and tuberculosis, while other bacteria, such as those that live in our intestines, are beneficial. Larger and more complicated free-living cells found in a drop of pond water are the protozoa seen here. Protozoan cells come in many different sizes, shapes, and colors. Because they live as independent organisms, many protozoans have developed special cell structures that allow them to move through the water in search of food. The cell of a paramecium is covered with tiny hair-like structures called cilia, which rapidly beat the water, resulting in cell locomotion. An amoeba slides over surfaces by extending out parts of its cell called pseudopods, or false feet, which then pull the rest of the cell along behind them. And this protozoan uses a whip-like flagellum to move its cell through the water. Cells of many protozoans gather together to form colonies of identical cells. The volvix seen here is one such colony of cells. But in larger, more biologically advanced creatures, called multicellular organisms, many different kinds of cells are joined together to perform specialized tasks. Generally speaking, the more cells a multicellular organism possesses, the larger its body will be. For example, it is estimated that an adult human being is made up of about 100 trillion cells. Whereas a smaller multicellular organism, such as a butterfly, would have only a few billion cells. Within the bodies of multicellular organisms, most cells of the same type will join together to form layers called tissues. Tissue layers of different cell types can be very clearly seen in this stained section of a frog's stomach. The reddish tissue layer seen here is made up of smooth muscle. These specialized cells are quite long and thin and can contract to help move food down the digestive tract. And these thick rectangular epithelial cells that make up the stomach's lining are specialized to release chemicals into the stomach sac to help digest food. Plants have tissues just like animals do. Here in this section of a plant's stem, many distinct layers of cells can be very clearly seen, and they tell an interesting story about how cells were discovered. Almost 400 years ago, while using a simple microscope like this to study slices of dried plant tissue, the English scientist Robert Hooke saw structures that reminded him of the tiny sleeping rooms called cells used by monks that he had seen in medieval monasteries. So it was, through this unlikely connection, that cells, the basic units of life, were named. For over 2 centuries after their discovery, scientists debated the importance and function of cells. Then around 1839, two German scientists, Theodor Schwann and M.J. Schleiden, came up with a theory to explain the role of cells in living things. The cell theory of Schleiden and Schwann consists of three parts. First, that all living things are made up of cells. Second, that cells are the basic structural and functional units of life. And third, that all cells come from other cells. Today, scientists still accept the basic principles of this early 19th century theory. And now many wonderful new scientific instruments, especially the electron microscope, have allowed contemporary biologists to probe deeply within cells to unlock some of the mysteries they contain. The basic material of all living cells is a jelly-like substance called protoplasm. The protoplasm of the simplest living creatures, such as bacteria, lacks the complicated structures found in more advanced organisms. But the protoplasm that makes up the cells of fungi, protozoa, plants, and animals is divided into two basic parts, easily distinguishable under a light microscope, namely a nucleus and the cytoplasm that surrounds it. Let us look more closely at the cytoplasm and nuclei of some of these more advanced cells. The nucleus is normally an oval or spherical structure found near the center of the cell. The nucleus is very important because it is the control center for the entire cell. The nucleus regulates and directs all of the cell's activities, from how it reproduces to how it uses food. In cells that are not dividing, the interior of the nucleus is filled with thread-like coils called chromatin that is made up of protein and a huge information storage molecule called DNA, short for deoxyribonucleic acid. Special areas of the giant DNA molecule called genes hold the information needed to construct proteins that are used to build and repair cells and are also critical to all normal cell functions. The DNA also carries the hereditary characteristics of a cell. In the case of a unicellular organism, like this paramecium, the genes of its DNA contain all the information needed to make a new paramecium that is an exact copy of the original parent cell. During cell reproduction, when two cells are formed from one cell, the chromatin condenses to form little worm-like structures called chromosomes that, having been duplicated, slide into the newly forming cells and then change back into chromatin again. In this way, the hereditary characteristics of the cell are passed from one generation to the next. Inside of the nucleus, along with the chromatin, is a small rounded object called the nucleolus, or little nucleus. The nucleolus is very dense and contains a large amount of a chemical similar to DNA called RNA, or ribonucleic acid. The special kind of RNA, found in the nucleolus called ribosomal RNA, passes into the cytoplasm through pores in the nuclear membrane that surrounds the nucleus. Here in the cytoplasm, the ribosomal RNA forms hundreds of thousands of tiny organs, or organelles, called ribosomes. It is on the surface of the ribosomes that the directions for making new proteins that arrive from the DNA in the form of another kind of RNA called messenger RNA are translated as new proteins are formed. Most but not all of the ribosomes in the cytoplasm are found attached to a very complicated system of flattened tubes called the endoplasmic reticulum. The proteins made by the ribosomes in one part of the cell can pass through the tubes of the endoplasmic reticulum on their way to other parts of the cell. Some cells actually export the proteins they make. These types of cells usually have a special system of tubular membranes called the Golgi apparatus, which seems to be part of the endoplasmic reticulum and that helps package proteins for transport outside of the cell. The Golgi apparatus even works in the opposite direction, as it transports substances already inside the cell into the tubes of the endoplasmic reticulum. Spread throughout the cytoplasm are other organelles, much larger than ribosomes, called mitochondria. Some cells, such as human liver cells, may possess 1,000 or more mitochondria. The mitochondria are known as the powerhouses of the cell, for within the tiny folds of these organelles, food materials, like sugars, are converted into special energy-rich molecules used by the cell to power its life processes. Because the mitochondria contain a small amount of DNA, enough for about 50 genes, some biologists believe that mitochondria developed millions of years ago as very simple free-living organisms, similar to bacteria, invaded other living cells, and then took up permanent residence inside of them. As might be expected, certain differences exist between the structure of animal and plant cells. Plants get their green color from a pigment called chlorophyll that is found in special cytoplasmic organelles called chloroplasts that are absent in animal cells. Within the chloroplasts of plants, the energy of the sun is captured as carbon dioxide and water are chemically combined to create sugars and oxygen by a process called photosynthesis. Plants and animals that eat plants then use these sugars for food. Like mitochondria, chloroplasts are believed to have developed from simple organisms that took up residence inside of other larger cells. The possibility of such an event occurring is not as unlikely as it might seem. Today, single-celled plant-like algae that can carry out photosynthesis are commonly found dwelling in the cytoplasm of the large cell of the protozoan called stentor, seen here. These algae presumably escaped being digested to assume a symbiotic relationship with the stentor. As a result of this mutually beneficial relationship, the stentor obtains food and oxygen from the algae in its cytoplasm, and the algae are protected from creatures that might eat them in the outside environment. Another difference between the cells of plants and animals is that animal cells possess tiny structures called centrioles or centrosomes that are the focal point for the spindle fibers found in dividing animal cells. Plant cells have spindle fibers but rarely have centrioles and are able to reproduce perfectly well without them. The spindle fibers found in dividing cells attach to the double chromosomes and then separate them into two equal groups. Spindle fibers are composed of the microtubules that make up a large part of the cell's cytoskeleton. Microtubules are very important in controlling both the shape and the internal arrangement of the organelles within a living cell. Both animal and plant cells also contain large water-filled sacs called vacuoles. Very often plants will have just one large vacuole, whereas animal cells will usually have several much smaller vacuoles. When the vacuoles of plant cells are filled with water, the plant and its leaves will be fairly rigid. But in the absence of water, the vacuoles empty out and the plant wilts. Here we see a contractile vacuole forming in a paramecium cell. These vacuoles slowly fill up with water that accumulates inside the cell and then pump it to the outside. By doing this, contractile vacuoles prevent cells from blowing apart. In this amoeba cell, food vacuoles form as pseudopods surround particles of food material in a process called phagocytosis. Digestion takes place inside of these food vacuoles in most unicellular organisms. And after digestion is complete, these vacuoles are filled up with undigested waste that is then released to the outside of the cell. Animal cells, but not plant cells, have many small rounded structures called lysosomes that are very similar to the food vacuoles of protozoa. Lysosomes contain digestive enzymes. Within them, large food molecules are broken down into smaller molecules that can then be used by the mitochondria to produce energy for the cell. Lysosomes also help organisms get rid of dead and dying cells. When a tadpole begins to lose its tail as it is transformed into a tailless adult frog, the lysosomes within the tail cells carry out this job. One other major difference between the cells of animals and those of plants is that plants possess a tough outer non-living layer called a cell wall, whereas animals lack a cell wall. The cell walls of plants join together to create rigid layers, allowing trees and other large plants to grow tall and upright. Both plants and animals possess a thin cell membrane, also called a plasmalemma or plasma membrane, that is very important to each type of cell. In plant cells, the cell membrane is found just inside of the cell wall, whereas in animals, the cell membrane creates the outer boundary of each individual cell. The cell membrane is a highly organized structure that performs a number of very important tasks. Everything the cell needs, including food, water, and oxygen, must pass through this membrane to enter the cell. Likewise, waste products exit the cell through this membrane. By controlling what enters and leaves the cell membrane helps maintain a state of perfect balance within the cell, called homeostasis. In animal and many protozoan cells, the cell membrane also performs the critical role of creating a physical boundary between the delicately balanced internal environment of the cell and the often dangerous, chaotic conditions that can exist outside the cell. Finally, the cell membrane allows the cell itself to be flexible and elastic. This allows the cells of animals and most protozoans to easily change shape, and this is a great help in creating an ease of motion that would be impossible in a rigid organism. In this program, we have been introduced to the world of cells. We have taken a brief look at their most important structures and have learned their primary functions. Yet many of the biochemical reactions which underlie those cellular functions are complex and not understood by even the most highly trained scientists using the most modern and sophisticated equipment. Still, cell research has shown that all of the structures in normal, healthy living cells work harmoniously together, performing whatever needs to be done to perpetuate life. Every second of every day, an individual cell performs thousands of incredibly diverse and yet interrelated jobs. And at all times, the internal structures of the cell are in continuous motion, throbbing, moving, breaking apart, coming together, stretching, and contracting. In the final analysis, cells can be thought of as marvelous and complex miniature factories, whose final product is none other than life itself. True or false? Cytoplasm is the part of a cell's protoplasm found inside of the nucleus. True or false? The nucleus contains very little of the cell's DNA. True or false? Genes are made up of DNA. These organelles, called, are where proteins are assembled. These organelles, called, are thought of as the powerhouses of the cell. Layers of identical cells found in most multicellular organisms are called the outer non-living layer of plant cells is called the Both animal and plant cells contain a thin flexible layer called the that is very important in controlling what enters and leaves the cell. True or false? Proteins can be packaged for export outside of the cell by a special structure called the Golgi apparatus. Photosynthesis is carried out in these organelles called